All right, good evening, guys. We are in Revelation 12. So we're in these sets of 7 again. So we saw the 7. What's that? There we go. Right. Trumpets was the previous one. So let's go back and do the summary from last week. So the summary from last week was that God's protection keeps Satan from destroying creation entirely. Mm-hmm. Even death and destruction will not convince some people. So we saw lack of repentance. Satan and his beasts have waged war on the Lamb and his followers, and they will conquer him by killing them. And then a time is coming when the dead will be judged, God's servants will be rewarded, and the destroyers of the earth will be destroyed. Okay? So what everybody got scared away from this week is the dragon at Christmas. Nobody wants to hear about the dragon at Christmas. I do. So let's turn to chapter 12. And there is so much here. We'll see. So my tendency is to just try to power through stuff probably too quickly, and so I'm going to try not to do that. I'm going to try to slow down a little bit tonight. Thank you. So my initial goal was to get through the 7 signs, just because the type A in me is we have to do all the 7 seals in one, and all the 7 trumpets in one, and so to leave it unfinished feels weird. But we'll see. We'll see if we'll get all the way through tonight. One of the things probably to notice tonight is we saw, hopefully last week, how much John is drawing on Exodus, right? And how well versed he is in that story, and we kind of miss some of that if we're not well versed in that story. One of the other things that we'll see tonight is John kind of makes a shift, and he's still going to focus on some of the Exodus echoes and parallels, but he's going to draw really heavy on Isaiah. And so he draws heavily on Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, some of the prophets, but there's just so many different allusions, right? We talked about scholars say somewhere between 750 to 1,000 Old Testament allusions in this book. So we can't go back and unfortunately revisit all of them, but we'll look at some of those tonight. So let's read. Let's just take it a chapter at a time and see how that goes tonight. So chapter 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven. Okay, so we're going to have 7 signs here. Sometimes John points out that it's a sign. Sometimes we just have to get the fact that it's a sign. Okay? And they're not evenly, whereas the last ones were hey, here's the first trumpet, a couple sentences, here's the next trumpet, a couple sentences. There was more evenly dispersed, and it was very easily discernible. This is going to change a little bit here, how he portions these out. So a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun and the moon and under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign, so here's sign 2, appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, and with 7 heads and 10 horns on its heads, 7 diadems. His tail swept a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Now war arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer a place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, who was called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ has come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives even unto death." And that's the word lives there is the word psyche that we had talked about previously. "Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows the time is short." And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of great eagles, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, and to a place where she is to be nourished for a time and a times and a half time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to help the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river, and the dragon had poured from its mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand and the sea. Okay, so what are some allusions that stick out just in that first chapter? I mean, there's lots, right? But like
the river flowing from the
mouth, Earth's mouth opening up and swallowing.
Okay, so there's sea imagery and earth imagery, which is probably reminiscent of like Red Sea and the parting of the Red Sea. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah.
Her wings.
What's that?
She had wings.
Wings. We've got wilderness talk.
Mm-hmm.
We've got previous echoes of how they conquer with the blood of the Lamb. Okay, so we're going to see this with this design pattern that we had talked about in the previous ones. So 1 through 4 are going to be death and destruction. And here this week we're going to see the dragon and the beast are represented in those. The 5th sign is going to be, we've talked about it'll be either the lamb or the dragon. And this week we go back to the lamb's army. So we had lamb's army, then dragon's army. Now we're back to the lamb's army. Number 6 is going to be the day of the Lord, and we'll see harvest imagery there. And then number 7 is God's kingdom come, and we'll go back to a picture of throne worship. Okay, so right now that's kind of how the design pattern flows for the signs. Right now we're still in sign 1 and sign 2. So sign 1 is going to be the woman, sign 2 is going to be the dragon, and then in the next chapter we're going to meet the beasts. Okay. So sign 1, we have a pregnant woman, and this is supposed to. Remember last week when John started not only like layering imagery, but he like multi-layered imagery, right? So it was at one point he says like, and this is Sodom, and this is Egypt, and this is the place where Jesus was crucified, right? So he's like multi-layering this imagery. He wants you to start thinking in multiple layers and allusions in the Old Testament. So in some ways, this woman can represent Eve, because Eve is the mother of all of God's children. In some ways, it's representative of Israel, because Israel is the mother of God's children, right? And our tendency probably is to think of who?
Mary,
right? Most likely, he's probably wanting us to think of Israel, because he's working out of Isaiah, and Isaiah in several instances talks about Israel as a mother of God's children. And so there's a couple of references there. Clothed in the sun and the moon, and under her feet, crown on her head with 12 stars. Stars typically for John mean angels, right? And here he's calling back to, does anybody remember the story of Jacob, when Jacob has his dream, Jacob in the coat of many colors? Anybody remember that? Jacob has this dream, and he's the youngest of 12 brothers, he basically has this dream, and he says, hey, guess what? I know I'm the youngest, but like God gave me this dream, and I'm gonna like lord over you, right? And his brothers end up getting jealous, and they throw him into a well, and there's the whole story. He becomes like the second hand in Egypt, right? So in that dream, he talks about being clothed or worshipped by the sun and the moon and the stars. And so he wants us to think back to kind of a pre-Egypt imagery. Okay. Sign number 2. So John jumps pretty quickly here, right? He says a great sign, and he says it's a woman, and we get, 2 sentences here, and then we're jumping into sign 2, and sign 2 is pretty much the rest of the chapter. So whereas our design pattern is a little bit different here, right? It's not like a couple sentences. We got a couple sentences and then a whole bunch. So we're going to focus in here on sign 2 a little bit more. Sign 2 is the dragon, who is the destroyer of the firstborn. And I want you just to see how this, how many layers that John is kind of alluding to here, right? So if you think back to Adam and Eve and the story of Cain and Abel, the serpent in the garden destroys Cain by turning him into a murderer. Pharaoh is called a sea dragon, and he kills the Israelite firstborn. Ezekiel calls Pharaoh a sea dragon. The destroying angel we looked at last week kills the Egyptian firstborn. The Israelites, one of the things they do after they leave Egypt is they end up worshiping this Canaanite god called Molech, and they end up sacrificing their firstborn children to this pagan deity. So they start, it's pretty much like Israel's lowest of the low, right? They're sacrificing those children to a pagan god. And then we see when Jesus steps on the scene that King Herod is killing the Israelite firstborn, right? And Matthew tells us that Jesus escapes this by going to Egypt. And his parents spend time there, and then he comes back. And then here we see the dragon seeks to kill the woman's male child. So like this motif is just multi-layered, right? And what the common theme throughout is that it's the serpent, the dragon, who is trying to kill the firstborn. Okay? So some of the description of the firstborn is that he has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns, and his tail swept a third of the angels, a third of the stars, to the earth. So we've talked some about Job as well, right? And so part of this is also reminiscent of Job. The picture was that there was a heavenly host up in heaven with God, all of the angels, right? And he talks about a war taking place, and Satan gets cast out of heaven with this group of angels. And we see that when Satan tempts Jesus in the desert, what does he tempt Jesus with? He says, all the kingdoms of the earth are mine. They're all mine to give to you. And Jesus doesn't debate that. He doesn't say, no, you're wrong. He just says, that's not the way I'm going to usher in my kingdom. So the dragon seeks to devour the woman, but she escapes, and the woman is protected where? In the wilderness, right? Which is also a heavily layered motif for Israel, right? It's a place of escape. It's also a place of temptation. It's a place of testing, right? You think of Jesus was tested in the wilderness. You think of Israel had to go through the wilderness. So multiple layers here of meaning and ideas, okay? So John says, and they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. Again, this, the language of how the Lamb conquers versus how the dragon conquers. in the irony in that the Lamb conquers by laying down his life. And it says that the Lamb followers also conquer by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. And again, we see that word here, psyche. They love not their lives unto death. And we talked kind of about what that meant last week or the week before. Rejoice, O heavens, woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come in great wrath. So John had previously given us a picture of people being scared of the Lamb coming and saying, like, oh, the wrath of the Lamb is coming, right? And they have this expectation of what might happen when the Lamb comes. Well, we see here that the devil has wrath, and we see what the devil's wrath is going to look like. Here John ties in all of these different names for Satan. So the ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the accuser, and the dragon. He's tying all of this imagery in together. And there are a few other times that we see, I think 2 other times in the Bible that we see Michael and his angels fighting. We don't have, that's a rabbit hole that, that we could dive down, but like we might not climb back out of it. But it is a very, very interesting one. And I think Michael is actually the only angel named in the Bible.
Isn't Gabriel named in the Bible?
Maybe you're right. I didn't know that. Where's that at? Oh, yeah. Google knows.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me show you how. So each of these is going to be tied into a sense into Isaiah. I won't read the whole text, so I'm going to give you kind of cliff notes to make it easier. But Isaiah 51 talks about how Israel, how there'll be a restoration from desert to Eden. And verse 9, it talks about how the dragon will be cut into pieces. He talks about in verse 10 how the sea will be dried up and the people of God will enter into Zion with singing. Does this all sound familiar? In verse 13, he talks about how Israel lives in constant terror because of the wrath of the oppressor who is bent on destruction. So John is drawing very heavily on Isaiah. And he wants us to think all the way back to Genesis. I think on your guys' handouts there, you have Genesis 3:14 through 15. The serpent, and the Hebrew word for that is nakash, interestingly, is a dust eater. The word in Hebrew for dust is afar. And in Genesis 2:7, it says that man was created from the dust. And then it says, God says that we will return to dust. Death is a return to dust. And so in Genesis, it says that the serpent is the dust eater. He will strike the heel of humanity, but God will send a man, Jesus, to crush his head. And here we see the way that the head of the serpent is crushed is through 12:11. The Lamb's followers conquer by the blood of the Lamb and the word of the testimony. So John's drawing on all of these themes, right? Like this was the initial promise all the way back in Genesis when the serpent tempted Adam and Eve and they were banned from the garden, that they are dust, that they will return to dust, and that this serpent who is their enemy is literally called a dust eater. Okay? John's also drawing on Isaiah 27. In Isaiah 27, he talks about a dragon who is slain and trumpets that sound, and the people will leave worship, or they will leave Egypt, and they will worship on God's holy mountain. next part of the text that we see is the sea, which is representative, remember, of chaos, right? Is the weapon of the beast, which has interesting parallels to the Red Sea as well. So then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand, which is the earth, and on the seashore. So what we're going to see here is these two places, the earth and the sea. Last week, I'm forgetting now where it was, but there was a place where we saw somebody standing on the edge of the sea and the land, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Anybody remember that it was? I had talked about it. Forecasting.
Squirrel? I mean, the squirrel.
Was it the beginning of the?
Yeah, in the interlude, the little scroll. This angel has his feet set on the sea and.
Right. Okay. And so we're going to see that continue to be played out here in chapter 13. Questions about 12 at all before we move on? Any?
There was a reference about the woman for a time and times and half a time.
Half a time.
What is that?
So there's all sorts of speculation about how that's being used. I mean, my best answer is I don't know. Some of the speculation is that it ends up being John has multiple different ways of saying 3.5, and so it's kind of like this. And 3.5 is half of 7. So scholars will say like this is like unfinished time. Like we're still waiting.
Because everything else is like painting a picture, you know.
Right.
So,
right, and then there's like these numbers.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, in the Message Bible, it says 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years.
Right.
So,
Yeah, okay.
Which was also the amount of time that Jerusalem was under siege.
Mm-hmm.
So it could be referencing that. Again, part of this, how people interpret it, goes back to that initial,
Your lens.
your lens of is this a future thing? Is this talking about the destruction of Jerusalem? Does the time have a symbolic meaning only, type of thing? That's, the numerology
Right.
is going to kind of depend on where you fall in that category.
In verse 13, it says, and it could just be the way that I'm reading it, and when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, when he saw himself thrown down to the earth, was like an outer body experience.
Right, that's an interesting phrase, right? It's like, what do you mean? Like, I think that's just John's way of saying, like, when he recognized, like, oh crap, I can't get back up there anymore, right? And you think of, in Job, we see Satan up in heaven, accusing or talking with God about what he can and can't do to Job. So it's this idea that like there was a war in heaven and he was cast down, and it's like he can't go back. In Luke 10:18, Jesus actually mentions this. Somebody want to pull up Luke 10:18 real quick.
Okay, sorry. Luke 10:18. He replied, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven."
Okay. So Jesus mentions, this very thing. That's straight out of the song we just sang, right?
Yep.
Yes.
And so, like, when exactly within Jesus' ministry that happened? Like, did Jesus, like, literally, was he mentioning that? We don't know exactly, but we do have in the Gospels, like, reference to Jesus being tempted by Satan in the desert. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that chapter before we move on?
The symbolism of the woman being given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the air.
So there are different texts that talk about God protecting Israel with eagle's wings and imagery of God being a mother.
Okay.
And so I think it's reminiscent of that, of like God's protection.
Okay.
We've talked about, like, we've seen in some of the Exodus plagues, and then last week how there's this balance between divine withdrawal, and that's kind of judgment, or divine protection, like saying, hey, you can't do that, you can't do this, right? And stopping evil. And so we saw some of that, I think, last week, where you said, like, God says, hey, you can't, like, you can come this far, but, and it does the same thing with Job.
Right.
Right. And so there's that balance of, like, how much God withdraws and allows evil to have its way as a way of judgment, and how much he protects and says, no, you can't touch. Right?
And I realize that the reference to the taste of honey and the bitterness, that's right out of Job.
Is it? Okay.
I read it once.
So John doesn't, I mean, we get this backstage scene into, like, Jesus being born, and he probably wants us to think more of Israel than of Mary. It's probably really easy. Like, I don't know about you, but my mind goes straightly to, like, oh, the woman has to be Mary because it's giving birth to Jesus. But John probably wants us to think of Israel more than Mary. But it's interesting because we don't get a lot of, like, extra definition that we would want, like, about, like, how this happens, about, Jesus' birth, or even, I mean, he jumps straight from, like, hey, the serpent wants to devour the baby, to, like, oh, the baby's, like, been born and lived his life and he's up with God, right? So it says, she gave birth to the male child. I mean, all we get is, she gave birth to the male child, the one who is to rule the nations, but her child was caught up to God, to his throne. Like, it was, we get birth to ascension in, like, one sentence, right? And then what happens is the pursuit of God's people, of Israel. So we're going to see the dragon is like, well, like, I can't have Jesus, so I'm going to continue to pursue the church. And really, it makes sense. Like, he's not spending a lot of time in that narrative space, because who's he writing to? He's writing to the churches who are concerned about this war that's going on earth, right? Any other things that stick out before we want to jump into 13? If you want to go down some of the other rabbit hole related to Michael, that is found in Daniel 10, Daniel 12, and then Jude 1.
Daniel 10 is where Gabriel's also mentioned.
Is it? Okay, that's where it is.
And in Luke as well.
Okay. Going once, going twice. You ready? We can go back to it. Okay, so now we've got sign 1, which is the woman. Sign 2, which is the dragon. And now we're going to move on to the henchman of the dragon, the beast. Okay, so sign number 3, chapter 13. And we're going to see 2 different beasts here, one from the sea and one from the land. And again, like, this draws up all sorts of imagery within Israel's past. So Job, we talked about, which was probably the earliest written book, talks about 2 different kinds of beasts in Job 40 and 41, Leviathan and the behemoth. Leviathan is the sea monster, and the behemoth is the land monster. And so there's this imagery of land beasts and sea beasts that are all through Israel's history that we typically don't visit or talk about. So we're going to talk about, in some sense, this first one is Leviathan, the sea beast. Okay. I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads. I tried to draw this, by the way, and I just had to give up after all. It just doesn't, yeah. 10 horns, 7 heads. So horns typically represent strength, right? And the heads can represent different things. With 10 diadems on its horns, and that's important because John's going to talk about 2 different kinds of crowns, right? We talked about previously how there's a Greek word for crown, which is like a victor's crown, which is somebody in like the Roman games or something. It'd be like a flowered, like that, and a diadem is like the real deal, like like a king's crown, like right, yeah. But this is my really poor attempt at trying to copy and paste clip art into to make this thing. There's only so much I can do.
I think it's pretty good.
Thank you. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, and its feet like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to the dragon gave his, and to it the dragon gave its power. So again, this constant theme of passive power, right? Like power is handed over. So the dragon is giving power to the beast, and his throne and his great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled at the following of the beast. Where have we seen something die and then come back to life before?
Christ. So like Antichrist?
Right, so we're going to see that the beasts often are a parody. They attempt to be a parody or mimic the Lamb. Okay, and we'll see that here. And they worship the dragon, right? And it evokes worship. They worship the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" Again, we remember the questions. John is using questions to evoke us to ask that question, like who is like this beast? Who can? And one of the, I think, previous questions we got was, who can stand on the day of the Lord? Right. So we have this contrast here. And the beast was given a mouth to utter haughty and blasphemous words, and was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies. Again, we're continuing with that theme of like the warfare is through the mouth. Against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling. That is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name was not written from before the foundation of the world in the book of life, who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for endurance and faith of the saints, one of John's common themes, right? So now we meet beast number 2. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. Okay, so again we see this parody. It's attempting to be something that it's not. It exercises all authority from the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, where we heard those words before, to be marked on the right hand and on the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. And this is one of those where we're going to see the mark of the beast here, which is really popular. which I would argue points to the fact that this text has to have validity to its first century audience. Otherwise, stuff like this doesn't make any sense. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of beasts. So he's telling his audience, who are the first century writers, you can figure out who this is if you try. For it is the number of a man. So the beast is a man, and his number is 666. Okay? So 2 beasts. And we are going to, let me back up here, because I didn't put this off for you, but I just want to go back and review. Where is it at? Pull this up, because this gives us some more insight into the dragon.
So the dragon was more powerful than the sea monster or sea creature, right? But the
So-
sea creature had 10 crowns.
So we have the dragon, which is Satan, which is the serpent, which is the devil, right? And then the dragon gives his power to Beast 1. And then Beast 2 comes along and points back to Beast 1. Does that make sense? Okay. And Beast 1 has a head that looks like it's been slain and has breath that's like breathed back into it. Okay, so let's go back. So we've looked at these two real quick. We're going to get into these, but let's go back to the dragon real quick, because I want to show you how some of these things that John is trying to get his readers to think about. Okay. So some of these are just a list of things that we see in Scripture that we know about Satan. So he was a murderer and a liar. John says John is talking in the Gospels, and he says, "You are from your father the devil. You choose to do your father's desires." This is Jesus. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks according to his own nature, because he is a liar and the father of lies. Okay, so we see this is Jesus talking about Satan from the beginning, right? And we see, what do we see in Genesis? Those two things, right? Satan lies to Adam and Eve, and he gets the firstborn to murder the secondborn. Peter says, "Discipline yourselves, keep alert, like a roaring lion. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around looking for someone to devour." So he's compared to a devouring lion. He also holds the power of death. Hebrews says, "Since the children shared flesh and blood, he himself," talking about Jesus, "likewise shared the same things, so that through death Jesus might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil." So Satan holds the power of death. And that is his main tool. He manipulates human governments to kill. We saw back in Revelation 2:10, the devil uses human government officials to kill followers of the Lamb. He's on the earth with his angels. We just saw in 12:8, the great dragon was thrown down, and we see him tempt Jesus. And I can send this to you guys if you want it, so you don't feel like you have to jot it all down. He has wrath. We just saw in 12:12, the devil came with wrath. He is the destroying angel. We saw in 9:11, he was called Abaddon and Apollyon. He's a destroyer.
That's interesting at 9/11.
Yeah, it is weird.
I like that. It's kind of jumped on. Wow, it's kind of weird.
Yeah. Although we tend to make associations with all sorts of stuff, so I try not to read too much into it. But it is, it's like one of those. He was the destroying angel in Egypt, trying to kill the firstborn. Hebrews 11:28 says, "By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, so the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel." Okay, so Hebrews, we talked about that question of like who was killing the firstborn. Hebrews clearly says that it was the destroyer, right? He let loose, Psalm says he let loose on them his fierce anger, wrath, indignation, distress, a company of destroying angels. And I think this was the one that I had mentioned last week that we didn't end up getting into. Paul says we must not put Christ to test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents, and did not complain as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. And he's talking about the Korah rebellion in the desert where the Israelites rebelled against Moses, and the earth, the text says the earth just like swallowed people whole.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is what, interesting for me. This is something that I thought was kind of interesting. Typically, things that we attribute like only to God having power over, the Bible says that He also has power over. So He has flood power, He has fire power, and He uses human armies to kill. So we see in 12:15, then from His mouth the serpent poured water. Right? We just saw that the serpent tried to destroy the woman with water. He has firepower. We see in Job that fire falls from heaven, and it's Satan. And also in Luke, it's interesting because Luke's, the disciples come to Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and they're like, "Hey, Jesus, can we call down fire from heaven?" And He's like, "You don't know what you're talking about. Like, you don't know what you're." He rebukes them for it. Okay. And then we also see in Job again and in other places that Satan uses armies. Okay, and so this kind of ties into because again, depending on who you talk to, some people will say that the beasts in this are representative of human leaders. I mean, John tells us the sign of the beast, that the second beast is a man, right? But a lot of people think that John is using this beast language to talk about the Roman Empire. And we'll see kind of why as we go along. But that's the empire that they're being persecuted here, apparently. Okay, so we have a sea beast, we have an earth beast who mimics the lamb but speaks like a dragon. He makes the earth worship the sea beast, and deceives those on earth with miracles, and he kills those who do not worship him. Again, a really big theme within this book, right, is worship. And who do you follow? Who do you worship? And the marks, he also marks his followers, just like, and so we see it's a parody again, right? Like the beast's followers are marked just like the lamb's followers are marked. Interesting concept with the marking, right, is what was the marking in Egypt?
Blood over the door.
The blood over the door? Okay. And the blood was the blood of what?
Lamb.
And that was to protect from who?
The destroyer.
Sound familiar? So who's doing the destroying?
Satan.
And who's doing the protecting? And how?
Jesus.
The blood of the lamb.
Okay. John's not making this stuff up. He's getting it from somewhere.
Right.
How did you derive 666?
Okay. I jumped that one. So I want to make a qualitative statement. I think a lot of scholars would say that this is pointing towards Emperor Nero. And the reason why they would say that is because Jewish letters were each assigned a number, And so you could give a number and give a person's name. And so within the copies that we have, the number that shows up is 666, but in some manuscripts it also shows up as 616. And both of those can be worked out to be Nero or Neron. And that was the Emperor Nero was probably the worst persecutor of the Christians. I don't know, are you guys familiar with Nero at all? No? I mean, he did some very nasty stuff. He, one of the things that he did was he would take Christians and tar them and put them on poles and light them on fire for his dinner parties. So, I mean,
And wasn't that like 64 AD? Like, wasn't it just like pretty recent after Jesus' passing?
I don't know the timeline on Nero. I'd have to look that one up. I don't know if he was.
I think it was pretty short after Christ's passing, which is why he was such a. I remember. I mean, this is going back to my Catholic days.
I can't remember
Christian
if
church,
he's
but
pre-temple destruction or post-temple destruction.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, so but people have used other 55 to what?
54 to 68 AD.
68, yeah, so just previous,
Yeah.
right? Then the preterist argument would be like, look, John is talking about this emperor, and look, this points to all the persecution just before the temple was destroyed, and so he wrote before 70 AD, so this goes to show like this, so that's kind of the line of the argument that goes on. People historically that have different views have like attributed 666 to like all sorts of different things, and all sorts of different people, and so it's one of those deals where everybody that's made a prediction has been wrong. So my personal belief is like I think he's probably talking about Emperor Nero. It makes the most sense to me in speaking to his immediate audience. It could possibly be the emperor after Nero, which I think was Domitian. So he could possibly be talking about him, but I think it's probably more likely Nero. It makes more sense to me. And he says, like, he assumes that his audience can figure this out.
Right.
And he says that the beast is man. Right? And we're talking about the church being massively persecuted, and this is the guy that we think kind of did it the best. Any other anything else on the second or the first beast?
I'm still stuck on why the C1 has 10 crowns versus the guy in charge has 7. They both have 7 heads and 10 horns, but the C1 beast had 10 diadems versus 7.
Yeah.
Versus the giant.
Yeah, I mean, some of this is also tied into like the Daniel 7 imagery, where Daniel talks about seeing a beast, and we could go there and read Daniel 7 if you guys want. But he basically talks about how he sees these 4 different beasts, and it's very similar imagery to this. So he may be pulling some from Daniel 7. I don't know why there's a difference.
Daniel 7:5, is that what you're looking for?
Yeah.
And therefore before me was a second beast which looked like a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides, and it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, "Get up and eat your fill of flesh." I don't know what you're talking about. There's another beast.
He talks about 4 different beasts, I think.
Yeah.
This is the end of chapter 7.
Yeah, the whole chapter, pretty
Yeah,
much.
there's all kinds of beasts in this one.
Yeah.
Which one?
Yeah, so he's pulling imagery from there. Okay, let's jump over to sign 5 then. Okay, so 1 through 4, remember death and destruction, right? So we've got the dragon chasing after the woman, we've got the dragon chasing after Israel or God's people, and we've got the beasts, both of the beasts which are demanding worship and trying to slay the followers of the Lamb, right? So 1 through 4 are death and destruction. Now we're going to move on to the Lamb and his army. So we're going to meet again that 144,000 that we've met before, that were the great multitude that nobody could count. And we had said that the 1,400 was a way of evoking this imagery of like a military census of Israel. Okay, so chapter 14. Then I looked, and behold, on the mountain stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters and like the sound of the loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of the harpists playing on their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. So we see the same group of people that we had seen in chapters 4 and 5, right? The elders and the creatures and the great multitude. 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they were blameless. Okay, let's pause right there. There are... I always get them mixed up. It's not Seventh-day Adventists. It's what's the other one?
Jehovah's Witnesses?
The Jehovah's Witness. I think some of them believe in like a literal, like there's only going to be 144,000, right? So if you want a fun question to ask them, is ask them if they're a virgin, right? Because it says, and really like the point is not virginity; it's this idea of purity, right? And we see that again happen in their mouth was no lie. And so we see this group, and they learn a new song, and so John kind of like takes us back to the throne room real quick, and then we're gonna go someplace else. Okay. Then I saw another angel flying directly overhead, and interestingly, I was reading. I think I have to double check this, so don't somebody check me on it, but. I think when I was reading, one of the scholars said this is the first and maybe the only reference in the Bible to an angel flying. Typically, we think of like angels as like flying and having wings, but like it's not the case. Or this. I think this is the first reference to that. With an eternal gospel to proclaim those who dwell on earth, to every nation and tribe and language and people. And that word gospel there is euangelion. It is a Roman word that was used for a king that conquered, that would come in and proclaim peace after they conquered. And so John is hijacking this Roman imperial language of like conquering to say like, oh yeah, our king comes and he conquers, but he comes in a different way. To proclaim to those who dwell on the earth in every nation and tribe and language and people. And he said with a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth and the sea and the springs of water. And another angel, a second, following him, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And another angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast in its image and receives a mark on its forehead or on its hand, He shall drink the wine of God's wrath, poured full strength into the cup of his anger, and he will be tormented with fire and sulfur in the presence of the holy angels, in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment goes up forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, these worshippers of the beast and its image, and whoever receives the mark on its name. Here is a call for endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of God and their faith in Jesus. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them." Okay? This is one of the texts. So, were any of you guys here when we talked about the 3 different views of hell? One? Okay, so there are, in kind of Christian history, 3 different views of hell. We have, one is eternal conscious torment. So, the unrepentant will be tormented or tortured forever. You have another one, which is annihilationism. And this is the idea that hell is death. And John actually calls, he uses language later on of second death. The second death. So this in part comes down to how you define death. And so we've talked some in another of the Life's Big Questions about 2 of the different views on death. Is one that it's the separation of body and soul, and the other is that you are a body soul, and so death is returned to dust, that there is no soul. Okay, so view 1, view 2, and view 3 is universalism. And this is typically the view that the fire is a purging fire. This would be the view that fire destroys. And this would be a view that the fire tortures. Okay? And so there are texts within Revelation that are all used to support these different views. So like this view would point to this text right here that says that they're tormented with fire and sulfur. This view would appeal to a text that we'll see later that talks about the second death, and that the fire is a second death. And this view might appeal to a text we'll see later in chapter 21-22, where it says, where it talks about heaven and the kings who are supposed to be dead are somehow outside, and it says that the gates of heaven will never be shut. And so each of these, there are texts that people appeal to. Can't all 3 be right? Only one can be right, but I'm just giving you guys this is the buffet of choices to choose from. Okay, the language that Isaiah uses in the language that John uses in this text actually comes from Isaiah, because John is as we've seen, he's pulling heavily from Isaiah here. So Isaiah 34. So here's where he's pulling the imagery from. This is Isaiah 34:9. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulfur, her land will become blazing pitch. It will not be quenched night or day, its smoke will rise forever from generation to generation. It will lie desolate, no one will ever pass through it again. So I think, along with other people, that this language of smoke and fire going on like forever and ever is used. In obviously Edom isn't still like burning today. Like we don't have like and we can't see the smoke. So it's hyperbolic language, exaggerated, to talk about like utter destruction. Okay, and it's a Jewish idiom of saying like completely destroyed, completely gone. And we'll get into, so he mentions in verse 10 that they will drink the wine of God's wrath. Okay? But John's mentioned that now, but he hasn't defined what that means. Okay? And we're going to see, we talked a little bit about wrath previously. We're going to see what that means in a little bit. Questions on this section? Because this is probably the time we got. Yeah, if we get into the next section, it'll be too much. Let me see what else I had on there. Yeah, so let's stop there and let's go like any questions or discussion. We'll get into 14 next time, as much as that pains me.
Is Behemoth where we kind of go like with the whole dinosaur concept?
Yeah, so if you want to get if you want to look into that, look into Job 40 and 41. The Leviathan, I think Behemoth is first, so I think Behemoth is 40, and then Leviathan is 41.
Okay.
And it was basically this idea of like God has created these massive monsters, and it's kind of in the section where God goes like, "Okay, Job, like you've been talking, it's my turn now, buddy." And he goes basically like, "Gird your loins. Where were you on the day that I created all of this stuff? Like, have you tamed the sea? Can you tell the sea where to go and no further? Can you like all this crazy like really cool imagery of like, can you, I think Job 41 is like, can you put a hook in Leviathan and reel him to shore type of thing? You know what I mean? Like it's this picture of like there's this sea beast and only God can tame him. And so it's kind of God saying like, let's, I don't think you want to compare here, right? Yeah. But there's all sorts of, and again, the fun resource Bible Project is doing a podcast. Their podcast right now is walking through. It's been cool how it's been just some resources like that have synced up for me. But they're doing a whole podcast on the theme of dragons and serpents in the Bible. Yeah, so language that we don't think about, the whole time. But their category of like dragon and sea dragon and serpent was all kind of like meshed into one.
So the dragon and the birth of Christ, birth of Jesus is what?
It's not the Christmas story.
So
Christmas story, yes.
yeah, okay, so let's we've seen that the dragon, right, is actively using human rulers and governments to achieve his desired ends, right?
King Herod.
Right. So the dragon is using human leaders and governments, and his desire is death and destruction. And we've already seen that a common theme is the killing of the firstborn. I mean, you already said it. Who's the leader government bent on death and destruction who's killing the firstborn when Jesus comes on the scene? And what does he tell the wise men?
Report back to me.
Hey, go find this guy
Yeah.
so I can worship him too.
Right. Yeah.
Right? So he acts like a lamb worshiper, but he's really the dragon.
Aaron the dragon.
Yeah? All sorts of like just ping, 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 you know, ties and stuff going on. Right? And we see in the story that this dragon falls to earth, right? And he takes 1/3 of the angels with him. Well, who does Jesus encounter right away in his ministry in the wilderness? Satan, right? And then what does he do all throughout his ministry? He encounters demons or unclean spirits. And there are indications that these unclean spirits are defined geographically as well. You remember the story of Legion, where Jesus encounters the man, and he says, "What's your name?" He asks the unclean spirit, "What's your name?" He says, "Legion," because we are many. I think this is the right one. I could be wrong. But
Legion is sometimes they say mob in the other translation because there were so many inside.
right, it was. But I think the word is legion, and it's associated with like a number for like an army. So, but they get what do they say? They say, "Don't cast us out of this geographic location. Cast us into." And so he goes, "Fine." He casts them into
Right.
the pigs. Yeah, jump off the cliff. Right. And then after Jesus does that, what do the people want to do?
Jesus.
Right. They want to kill him.
Oh, bacon deficiency. No, sorry.
Right.
shouldn't
Well,
say
I mean,
that.
It's
so
all about the bacon.
right. It
Right.
is.
Still,
I mean, okay,
that's
but
a bacon deficiency.
I mean, think about some dude rolls in and
Vision and
kills all of
attitude.
your livestock,
Right.
right?
Not happy.
Yeah.
No.
Not at all.
If we speculated about this Tuesday night at Soul Sisters, because we actually went over that scripture, and we decided, well, maybe, like in Job's case, maybe they were given a multitude more than they had to start with, like to reward. We don't know, because it never mentions what happened to the people who owned those livestock.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. How are we doing on time?
Yeah. Just right about 7.
Okay, so we'll come back to this. What we're going to see, I'll just kind of give you a preview. And remember, next week I'm gone, so no next week, but we'll do this the following week. Okay? So next week we're going to see a harvest, and we've talked about the number 6 within this design pattern has to do with the day of the Lord. So we're going to see a harvest. And this one's interesting because this one's kind of a hotly debated topic. And then we're going to see the throne room, which is the coming of God's kingdom.
Yeah, we're going to meet on there because that's so big. It's noted as being night because of the big weekend.
Yes, I think we'll still meet.
on the third.
Unless nobody in here wants to meet, and then maybe we should postpone it.
I'm thinking Bruce might be home, so he would love to go. Bruce and
Okay. You guys gonna be around?
Should be.
Okay, we'll still plan on meeting then. So next week we'll look at these two, wrap up. No, sorry. Well, wrap up the signs. So let me give you the summary for tonight. The great red dragon, the ancient serpent, the devil, the Satan, has always been behind the scenes waging war with the Lamb and his followers. The Lamb followers are called to endurance and faith as they fear God and give him glory. And evil is like a boomerang that is self-defeating. The dragon and his followers will conquer with the blood of the Lamb by laying down their lives. Okay? We'll get into kind of that last summary statement. The last summary statement has a little bit more with where we didn't get to yet. But here's an interesting question we can just close with and leave it hanging on that. When you think of blood, do you think of life or death? What's your gut like? What's your
Like,
Life.
Absolutely.
life? Who said death?
When I think of blood, you think something bad must have happened because you shouldn't see blood.
Okay, so death.
I'm not sure if you're down there.
Because blood is like a recurring theme that we're seeing, right? And so, but it can have an either or connotation, and it depends on how you look at it.
Yeah.
So we will we'll talk about that some next week because it can. Yes. Sorry. Because we're all going to show up next week. I'm not going to be here. Yeah.
Someone will show up here next week. Watch.
right.
Cool. Any parting thoughts?
Good luck.
I'll say good luck, yeah.
Yeah,
Exactly.
good.
Now, when is the actual race again?
Sunday.
Okay.
Yep. So I will. My race will be starting. Well, I think they're a day
They're ahead.
ahead of us.
16 hours, 10 hours, or 10 hours ahead.
Yeah. So my race will start at like 10:30 p.m. on your Saturday night.
Yeah. Huh.
So I'll be racing while you guys sleep.
So we get the test results during the service the following day, right?
You can. Yeah.
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 Wait,
The test.
The test result,
Yeah. I'll post something on social
Cool.
saying how it went. I'm sure.
Very cool.
Cool.
All right, let me pray for us. Father, thank you for this crazy book that you inspired John to write. God, I pray that we would take to heart the things that he has said, that as your saints, as your holy ones, that we would learn to have patience and endurance. God, open our eyes to the cosmic spiritual warfare that's going on all around us. Oftentimes we don't have eyes to see or ears to hear. And so God, I pray that you would just make us aware of what's going on, knowing that there is a dragon, that Satan, the devil, is working in and behind the scenes oftentimes, seeking to kill, steal, and destroy. But God, we know that you have overcome death, and so we no longer have to fear that. We know that you are both the giver and the restorer of life. And so may we follow after the Lamb, may we conquer by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. We thank you and we love you. Amen.